My brothers and sisters, Easter and the resurrection of Jesus is not merely a historical event, although indeed it is. But because it is a historical event, and God is very much part of this historical event, that the resurrection and Easter is not just an historical event, but an ongoing event. It is something that is as much present now, today, as it will be tomorrow, and as it was back on the first Easter Sunday. And as we have been going through these last 8 days of Easter, this octave, these are the highest holy days of the church, where we celebrate the same thing over and over and over again for 8 days. I mean, what kind of holiday other than this is there? Well, maybe Christmas, but other holidays like this, that now we, as our celebration of these 8 days come to a conclusion on this Easter Sunday, we begin to consider how this resurrection is something that is life-going or ongoing. It's ongoing for disciples from age to age to age, for people who have not seen Jesus. This seems to be the transition that the readings are dealing with today. Moving from people who have actually experienced the historical event and transitioning to an ongoing event by God. And we see this in the experience of Thomas, and we see this in the recollections of Peter in his letter, as well as some descriptions in the Acts of the Apostles. In today's gospel, we see that on the very evening of Easter, Jesus appears in the midst of the disciples who were locked away in fear. And he says to them, "Peace be with you." That's a greeting that was traditional in the Jewish days. They say shalom. But then he says it a couple of more times. And this greeting becomes more than a greeting, but rather a gift. That this peace that Jesus gives to the church, this peace is the resurrection reality that has been unleashed into the world by the resurrection of Jesus. And it continues to go and is ongoing by the power of the Holy Spirit that Jesus breathes into the world. Just like God breathed over the waters of chaos in the creation accounts, so now Jesus breathes that same breath into his disciples, recreating them, renewing them, revivifying them in this resurrection that will be ongoing. In this resurrection, then, it's about living with Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, standing in our midst, somehow seeing him, apprehending him, yet not actually physically seeing him, like Thomas was fortunate to be able to have done. And in so doing, Jesus gives us this ongoing mission to make sure that the resurrection is ongoing. For unleashing the resurrection into the world was the mission of Jesus sent by the Father. And now it's the job of the church that Jesus sends to continue the mission of this ongoing resurrection. Jesus says this, "As the Father has sent me, so now I send you. And I send you with peace, and with me, the power of the Holy Spirit. And he says an interesting thing. He says that what the sins that you have forgiven will be forgiven, and the sins that you hold bound will hold bound. It seems like the primary task of allowing the resurrection to be ongoing is for the church to be some kind of agent of forgiveness, agent of reconciliation, agent of bringing people from a life that is opposed to God to a life that is reconciled with God. We as a church are not in the position to do the forgiving. That's God's job. We as the church are there to open up that forgiveness of God to those who need it. So an implication is that people need to know that they need God in the first place before they're able to welcome God in the second place. And that's a trick. That's a chore. That's no easy task. How this can be done easily or Jesus' way. The easy way is to just wag the finger at everybody that we think are sinful. We wag the finger and condemn people who do the wrong thing and make them insist that they need God, you know? It's kind of like, gee, you look awful. You need God. That doesn't really work, does it? Yet there is an alternative. The alternative that Jesus gives to the church. The alternative that Jesus calls the church to follow. And that alternative is living in a way that is in this peace of God that is so different from the way the world lives, that the world recognizes that it needs God because they see the folks who have God and then desire to be reconciled to that God. It's called, in the vernacular, we often say, we say, how are you? And we say, hey, I'm living the life. Well, being a Christian is living the life of abundance that God has given to us. And by living the life of abundance that God has given to us in this peace and in the power of the Holy Spirit, makes us stand out, makes us be different. We see how the early church was doing this in the Acts of the Apostles. They were gathering around the teachings of the apostles. They were living a communal life where everybody in the community was recognized, everybody's name was known, everybody's trials and tribulations and joys were shared with one another, that everybody counted for something. The communal life. Teachings of the apostles, breaking of the bread, that they had some form of liturgy of the Eucharist in which they were able to not only acknowledge the resurrection, but to participate in it. And then prayer. All of these things being done on a regular basis, it's said like every day in the Acts of the Apostles, made the Christians stand out, made the Christians be able to face the difficulties of the world that they lived in with a certain kind of peace, with a certain kind of strength that was able then to engage the difficulties and to heal them and to transform them and to bring them over to God. With the pandemics that have been on our mind in the last couple of years, One of the things that made the Christians really stand out in the early part of the church in living this life had to do with the way they dealt with plagues and smaller, like epidemics. They weren't pandemics at the time. But when there were these little plagues or diseases that would hit different communities, the wealthy, the rich, and the well-off all kind of like fled away and hid from the disease to protect themselves. The Christians, on the other hand, ran right into it. The Christians, on the other hand, because they knew that they were uplifted by Christ, lived with those who were sick, accompanied and comforted those who were ill. They stood out. They were different. And people wanted to be like them. This Easter candle is the risen Christ that represents the risen Christ standing in our midst, as Jesus did on that first Easter night, bearing the wounds as Jesus did on that first Easter night, showing that even on that first Easter night, when the resurrection reality was in its full blast, it was by no means perfect, for it carried wounds, but it was not bound by the wounds. Living as Christians in the resurrection reality of God's kingdom means to accept the world as it is, not as we would like it to be, and to love it. And love it with our own imperfections. Love it with our own woundedness, knowing that we are not bound by them. Can you imagine a parish that lives in this way? What would it look like? What would it have to do? How would it be different from every other church and social club that exists, even in the smallest communities around the world? What kind of fruit would such a parish bear in being the church in that little part of the world? The resurrection of Jesus is not an historical event, rather an ongoing event. How does the resurrected Jesus stand in your life? And how is that standing shared with others, both in our parish and within our communities at large? For this is where the resurrection hits the road. This is where the resurrection remains ongoing.